You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And I gotta say, Kemper, nobody has really commented on it, but we haven't necessarily been super positive on some of the last novels we've covered, I would say. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Not as positive as we've been on others, yes.
Yeah, I think that's going to change, folks.
We have the honor, the privilege of covering Endless Night by Agatha Christie in this episode. This is a big one, folks. This is arguably our last big one. So we are just going to fet this thing, or should I say fate this thing, to the heavens, I think. With qualifications, of course, and quibbles and whatnot. We'll get into it. But I am thrilled to report that I enjoyed my reread of this novel even more than I expected to. This is a fantastic novel.
Yeah, I think that we can just start this episode by saying that this is terrific. And any quibbles that we have going forward, and we will have them, know that we're saying that with the utmost respect, because what this novel is doing is just very, very good.
Well, and here comes one, although it's not so much a quibble as a disclaimer, because before we even get into our publication history, I should note the working title for this novel, which was Gypsy's Acre. And Gypsy's Acre is a name of a property that's going to come up a lot. It's impossible not to reference as we're talking about this novel. And the notion of quote unquote gypsies is one that we're going to be discussing a lot. I would just like to put it out there, and we will, of course, be revisiting this in our depictions stuck in their time category later on the episode. But I think it's worth noting up front, we are fully aware that the term gypsy is considered a slur by many, if not most, at this point, that it is an outdated term, an inaccurate one, referring to the Romani people or Roma people. I think, though, it's very difficult to discuss this book without referencing the word and saying the word. But I just wanted to put that out there up front.
Language is difficult to change, and so we will talk about this in the stuck in its time category. But yes, I think that's a very fair disclaimer. And Lord knows that I have loved driving around in a convertible with one of my good friends and screaming at the top of my lungs the Stevie Nicks song, Gypsy.
By the way, my preferred alternate title for this novel would be Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But
I wondered when you would bring that up. And I literally, we know each other so well that I was reading this and I was like, he's going to make that joke. And this is how you know, guys, that Kemper is a dad.
Dad jokes are not just for dads, Catherine.
Well, I make terrible puns, but that is a dad joke.
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborhood.
Won't you be mine? Yeah, if you have made me sing in other episodes, that has to be left in, and I'm informing all of our listeners.
I just like everyone to picture Mike Rogers putting his little zip-up sweater on and taking off his dress shoes and putting on his sneakers. Let's just imagine that that's happening right now as we're about to sit down with Mr. Rogers and he tells us a nice little yarn about about his
with
neighborhood.
puppets.
Yeah, with puppets. Oh boy, it gets even scarier. All right, Catherine, what is the publication history of this novel?
So it was first published in the UK by Collins Crime in October of 1967, and then by Dodd Mead in the US in 1968, but it actually got serialized in the Saturday Evening Post in February and March of 1968 in the US, apparently with Tom Adams illustrations. And, you know, there's like a very beautiful tabletop book of Tom Adams paintings that were used primarily for the Fontana editions. So I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely. Love all of those Tom Adams illustrations. They're, I think, a huge part of the history of Christie publications.
You know me, the Fontanas are my favorites.
Just a little bit of extra publication history. Per our good friend John Curran, the germ for this novel appeared 6 years before it was published on a notebook page dated 1961. And apparently Christie actually began drafting it in the United States in late 1966 when she was accompanying her husband Max on a lecture tour. And then also per John Curran, I love this little fun fact. When the book came out in September of 1967, Christie sent Billy Collins, of Collins fame, of course, a, quote, blistering letter for not having received her so-called advance copies of Endless Night before she saw them herself on sale at the airport. And I just love that image of Christie, you know, jetting around with Max and then being like, excuse me, at like an airport kiosk, seeing Endless Night just sitting there, and she had like never even gotten her copy.
I totally feel her on that. And I also want to mention that, you know, we didn't publish this on our podcast, but if anybody was watching the virtual stream of the International Agatha Christie Festival last year, Kemper and I did an interview with Matthew Pritchard, Agatha's only grandchild, and the head of Agatha Christie Limited. It's still available on YouTube. You can go find it. He made a note that this was his favorite of Christie's books, and also that she had used insights from him and his mates at university to write this. So yeah, I thought that was like a really fascinating insight that he had when he was talking to us. And she also apparently had brought them to, I think, Salzburg. Am I mistaken, Kemper?
I think it was Salzburg. In my memory, it was somewhere in Germany or Austria, something like that. Definitely, they had gone to music festivals together, and he and his friends went with her. And yeah, I love that we kind of broke that little insight into this very novel, because I did the math too. And Michael Rogers, our protagonist, first person narrator here, is 22 at the start of the novel. And Matthew Pritchard would have been about 23/24 when she was writing it. And we know that she was thinking about it for even a couple of years before that, even though we'll talk about this a little later, but she actually wrote it extremely quickly. She wrote this book in 6 weeks, which is amazing. And that's about half the time she usually took on books. She usually wrote them in about 3 to 4 months.
I love the anecdote that she was traveling with her grandson and his friends to music festivals and used them as her inspiration for what young people were like in 1967.
You know, she even herself talked about this after the book came out, about how shocked people were that she could inhabit such a young character. And she said people shook their heads as much as to say, what is a county lady like that doing with such a character? She'll make a terrible mess of it. Well, I don't think I did, and it wasn't terribly hard. I listened to my cleaning woman talking and to her relatives. I've always loved shops and buses and cafes, and I keep my ears open. That's the secret. And I think we can add to that. And you also listen to your grandson because he remembers that you did that, which makes a lot of sense. When we asked him that question, by the way, his answer was so fascinating because it was bifurcated. On a personal level, Endless Night was his favorite Agatha Christie novel. And then on a professional level, it was Murder on the Orient Express, because it did so much for the Christie Limited business, not once, but twice. with the splashy 70s adaptation and then the Kenneth Branagh extravaganza, with apologies to Alfred Molina in the middle there. I don't think the Alfred Molina version did very much for the Christie estate.
Apologies to Alfred Molina. I don't think that adaptation did a lot for anyone.
This is true. I would say, actually, that bringing up Matthew Pritchard is quite appropriate before we get into our usual breakdown, because I did just want to mention the dedication of this novel, which is interesting. And it reads, "To Nora Pritchard, from whom I first heard the legend of Gypsy's Acre." And Nora Pritchard is, of course, Matthew Pritchard's other grandmother. That would be his father's mother. I'm also getting this information from John Curran. We know that she lived in the real location of Gypsy's Acre, which was near, I'm going to mess this up, it's a Welsh name. I have some pity on me. I think we can all acknowledge that Welsh names are really hard to pronounce, but Pentermyric or Myrich in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales.
There's no way that pronunciation is accurate.
You know what? Please let us know. Tweet at Catherine what the correct pronunciation of that is. She loves getting pronunciation corrections. So apparently there really was a gypsy encampment around there that was cleared out. The quote unquote head gypsy cursed the land. And then after numerous road accidents occurred in the vicinity, this is how that supposedly, allegedly apocryphal tale gathered support. Or maybe there really was a curse. We don't know. Before we get into who our victims are, we should just note that, of course, there's an epigraph at the start of this novel, because this is another title that is quoting from a poem. And this is a really good poem, isn't it? It's William Blake. It's certainly a lot better than the nursery rhymes that we got a lot in mid-career Christie.
Right.
It's very creepy and atmospheric, and I'll just read it out. "Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night." And that will be coming up a whole lot more in the course of the novel as well.
Let's talk about the victim, because this gets a little complicated, doesn't it?
It does.
All right. So let's note up front, it's not a puzzle mystery, nor do we have victims until very much the end of the book. But our main victim is Fenella Ellie Goodman / Rogers, who is a very lovely American heiress who is deeply in love with her husband, and she seemingly falls from a horse and then dies of cardiac arrest.
I think hands down Christie's most likable American she ever created, because she is just a delight.
Yeah, Ellie is lovely.
I mean, she's rich, so she passes the bar for an American in a Christie novel. You do got to be rich. But she's also lovely as opposed to detestable, as most of the Americans.
We should go back at some point and track and see if there's any American written in a Christie novel who is not an heiress.
It's true. All right. So next up, in terms of our victims, the people who die in the course of this novel, we've got Claudia Hardcastle, a lady of the village near the estate where Ellie and her husband live. And she also falls from a horse and dies shortly thereafter. And it's very curious that this happens in the same way. And perhaps we will learn more about what happened to her as we get into our summary.
So then we have Rudolph Santonex, who he's not exactly a victim here. He does die, but he's the architect of the house in this book. And the house, let's just put it this way, is incredibly important to the plot of this book.
We actually have two more victims at the end of this book who die, and die pretty horribly. We're going to hold off from saying exactly who they are, but just know that they feature among our cast of suspects, who we will get to now, and all will be revealed by the time we get to the end of our plot summary. So first up, we have Esther Lee, who is the resident gypsy, essentially. She's a fortune teller. She's a possible blackmailer. She seems to just kind of loiter and lurk about the premises of Gypsy's Acre and the village nearby, and potentially be up to no good.
Right. And then we have Michael Rogers, Mike, who is Ellie's beloved husband. He Ellie is kind of a jack of all trades from a lower class upbringing. We always should suspect the husband, right?
Then we have Greta Anderson, who's Ellie's beloved companion. She's a bit of a minder. She started working for Ellie when Ellie, I believe, was 17 years old. So she's a couple of years older than her, and they have a friendship. Ellie considers her best friend, but it is also a relationship that was started as more of an employer-employee thing. And Greta is beautiful. She's blonde, blue-eyed. She is of German and Swedish extraction, and Ellie is very devoted to her, and Greta seems to be very devoted to Ellie as well.
Right, and we have Cora Van Stuyvesant, who is Ellie's stepmother, who she doesn't get along with very well, who definitely is like a little bit suspicious because Ellie doesn't like her, and Ellie seems to like everybody.
And then we have a number of other characters who populate the novel. And, you know, it's interesting because they aren't really suspects, again, because this novel is not really functioning as a puzzle mystery. But there are lukewarm attempts made at making them into suspects at several points within the novel. And I may as well just get to this now since I'm bringing up the issue. But this is, I thought, was really fascinating when I was researching how this book was written. When Christie handed in the manuscript for Endless Night, it was very, very, very much not a whodunit. It was really a psychological thriller, which is still what the published version is. But Collins apparently said, well, we kind of want to have our cake and eat it too. We want our whodunit element because that's what people have come to expect when they get their Christie for Christmas. So could you just kind of sort of try to make this a little bit more of a whodunit? And we can get specific later on when we're on the other side of our summary, but there are a few plot points in here that are almost loose ends that she introduced via handwritten amendments to the typewritten manuscript that she submitted to Collins. And they're a bit haphazardly done. I don't think her heart was really in them. And as John Curran says, the book would have been a whole lot better if she had just been allowed to do what she wanted to do in the first place, because this really is a fantastic psychological thriller and it doesn't need to be a whodunit. So we could say that the rest of these people are suspects, even though they really only kind of sort of are. And the first one up is Andrew Lippincott, who is Uncle Andrew to Ellie, even though he's not really her uncle. You might remember, oddly, that there is another Uncle Andrew in an early Christie novel. That was Andrew Pennington in Death on the Nile. Right. So another rich heiress who had a quote unquote Uncle Andrew who was her lawyer. And he is sort of in the background and he makes a couple of key appearances throughout the novel.
We have Stanford Lloyd, who turns out used to be married to Claudia. And he's another trustee of Ellie's massive estate.
Then we have Major Philpott, who has to be a reference to Eden Philpotts, who is Agatha Christie's, well, Agatha Miller's neighbor when she was a very, very young woman, even a girl, and she was an aspiring writer. This was the very, very established and well-published local Devon writer who encouraged a young Agatha Miller to continue writing and who read her early pieces and said, yeah, you have real talent. You should continue on with this. And she was very grateful to him, and they sustained a lifelong friendship and regard for each other. So I think it was an homage to him to name him Major Philpott. She doesn't usually do that, right? It's very rare for her to use real people's last names. He's a local magistrate. He's called God. He is sort of in charge of everyone's business. He's in everyone's business, and he's just the man in charge, the local country squire, essentially. We've seen this character before. Mm-hmm. All of those characters, it's funny, Stanford Lloyd, Andrew Lippincott, Major Philpott, Cora Van Stuyvesant, and Claudia Hardcastle, they're all kind of in the vicinity when these deaths are happening, but it's so muddy and it's so loose for a standard Christie puzzle mystery, which is why it's like, yeah, I guess they're kind of suspects, but it's all just very hazy and vague.
Right. And then also we can't not mention Mrs. Rogers, who is Michael's mother, who seems to be annoying and harsh and prying and low class. And like something is up with her. There is something up with her. We'll get there.
So the world as it appears to be We open on Mike Rogers, such an unusual Christie first-person narrator because he is young, he is male, and he is from the working class. It's actually not unusual for Christie to be inhabiting a male narrator. She actually did it, I believe, 7 times, and that's not even counting the Hastings novels.
Right.
So she's quite capable of inhabiting the male sex, I think, when it comes to narrative voice. But this is, in those other ways, I think, quite a departure for her. And one of the most remarkable things about this book is how handily she nails the voice right from the beginning. And it sounds different, too.
I have to say, she got something from hanging around her grandson's friends, because the second you start reading this, even in 2021, you can hear the right cadence. It's like spot on. It
is. The sentences are shorter and more declarative than they normally are. And, there are times when I'll just take 2 examples because I think it's worth dwelling on this for a second because it's part of why this book is so brilliant. A lot of what Mike as narrator is discussing are things that Christie has had her narrators or herself as third-person narrator discuss in other novels. Like, for example, he goes on and on about how he's not really a writer and he doesn't know how to begin, and he has misgivings about how he's going to do all of this. That's very much what Amy Leatherin did in Murder in Mesopotamia, for example. But he's doing it with his voice. And then this, I think, was one of the most brilliant passages because I really could put it in context with the Christie canon. There's a point early-ish on when Mike is talking about essentially the difference between love and sex. And this is what he says. I didn't know at that time anything about love. All I knew about was sex. That was all anybody of my generation seemed to know about. We talked about it too much, I think, and heard too much about it and took it too seriously. We didn't know, any of my friends or myself, what it was really going to be when it happened. Love, I mean. We were young and virile, and we looked the girls over we met, and we appreciated their curves and their legs and the kind of eye they gave you. And you thought to yourself, will they or won't they? Should I be wasting my time? That passage is basically the same rant that Miss Marple has gone on multiple times by this point about how young people nowadays look at sex as a sort of duty, and they don't seem to have as much fun with it because they talk about it so much and because they're so obsessed with it, as opposed to the older generation who enjoyed themselves behind closed doors and the reserve was part of the thrill. She's brilliantly recalibrating that same point for Mike Rogers, this 22-year-old tough guy. Also, and it's so convincing, Also,
I mean, did you notice what word gets used repeatedly in this book?
What would that word be?
It would be bitch.
Yeah, well, Christie's not afraid to use the word bitch, I have to say, but it does get used more here than it does in other books. This is true.
Yeah, it gets used at a remarkable level, I think, to me. I mean, I found it notable. And, again, Mike Rogers is a first-person narrator. So just keep that in mind, people.
Meaning we can trust him fully. And there's, there's no sort of skewed perspective he could possibly be trying to pull over on us at any point.
No, somebody talking a lot about sex and using the word bitch. I'm sure that's a trustworthy dude.
While we're on this point, in dialogue, I noticed Mike uses a lot of, I'll call them quote unquote, adorably working class phrases like schmozzle. He calls someone ducks. He says she's the tops, and he uses words like toff and stuff like that. But then when he's narrating to us and he's his more real, hard and cold version of who he is, he doesn't use those cutesy words. And it's the short declarative sentences. And he's likable, but boy, is he edgy from the beginning. You're already on your guard about what kind of a person
Mike Rogers in 2021 really spends a lot of time on Reddit, and then he secretly spends a lot of time on 4chan.
He might have a hit podcast in 2021, though, is the sad thing. Like, Mike Rogers in 2021 could actually have quite the following.
Very edgelord. Anyway, during one of his many jobs, which also is very 2021, because he basically works in a gig economy.
He totally does. Oh my God, he's an Uber driver.
He's an Uber driver. That's exactly what he is. You know, it's like briefly called a chauffeur, but he switches around between gigs, and then sometimes he does like other side hustles. And so during one of those gigs, he made friends with this famous architect who was Rudolf Santonix. And then he ends up seeing this auction for this apparently cursed chunk of land called Gypsy's Acre. And he goes to the auction even though he can't obviously afford to buy it. And, you know, he's warned off by Mrs. Lee, who's the gypsy lady. And then at the auction, no one wants to buy the land because everybody has heard the cursed legend. So nobody wants to buy it.
Right. So while wandering this property that he is sort of obsessed with and that is still technically available, this is when he runs into Ellie Gutman, or Goodman, which is how she introduces herself. And she and he basically have a joint love fest over the land, the sweeping views that it provides. And they agree that this decrepit old Victorian mansion that's built on it is all wrong, and that, you know, you would just tear that down and build something new and fresh and beautiful. And it seems that they fall in love at first sight, both with each other and the land. Ellie tells Mike that she's basically been sent there by her beloved companion, Greta, because Greta's been telling her, you should try to find some property in England rather than settling in the United States, where all of your awful relatives want you to settle and, you know, introduce you to all of these awful men that they'll probably just try to marry you off to. And Greta is just looking out for her and trying to, you know, help her live her best life. And Mike just, you know, seems to fall for this bewitching and pretty and just sweet and lovely young woman.
You know, it's partially because, you know, he's a poor and Ali is a rich American, and then he doesn't feel like he can marry her. And, you know, he ends up going to his mother, in large part trying to get some sort of funding so that he can propose to Ellie. And he doesn't really actually totally realize, it seems, that Ellie is rich. Ellie, she goes first back to the United States, and then she comes back to England, and she has bought Gypsy's Acre. It turns out he didn't need the money because she's a ludicrously rich heiress. She's one of the richest heiresses in the United States.
He calls her a poor little rich girl from the beginning of their relationship, but that's understating the matter a bit.
Yeah, so what do? They get married in secret, obviously.
So romantic.
Kemper, gotta tell you, given that we did Rebecca on Patreon for this month, do you see some maybe echoes?
Yeah, it's actually pretty remarkable to have just read Rebecca and then read Endless Night. There are quite a few echoes. And I think, I'm not saying that Christie was directly influenced by Rebecca, but I think that it just shows how in some ways they're in a similar genre and they cross genres similarly and also do the same feint and dodge, the dodge and weave, if you will, of putting themselves out there as being romantic tales and then sweeping that carpet out from under your feet as a reader by the end. As we discussed on our Patreon, Rebecca is subtler about it so that some people, I think, never actually know that the carpet was in fact swept from under their feet. But you know it by the end of Endless Night. That's for sure.
For sure. By the end of this book, for sure you do. Rebecca is a little bit of a trickier thing.
Proposition. Yeah. I think that's part of the power of this book is that for a large portion of the book, you're not exactly sure what you are reading, like what the genre is. I think we're put on notice from the beginning just by Mike's voice, especially if we know what Christie usually writes, that she's doing something different here. But it does seem potentially romantic at first. And I'm actually going to say this, and I'm saying it as a huge compliment. This book very much feels like a Mary Westmacott book for like 7/8 of it until the very end. Having, we've only covered 2 of the 6 Mary Westmacotts thus far on our Patreon. Apparently, we're just going to talk about our Patreon account a lot in this episode. But, we've read Unfinished Portrait and The Rose and the Yew Tree. And The Rose and the Yew Tree in particular is just excellent. Mm-hmm. And Christie, we said this about Sad Cypress as well, that Sad Cypress feels like a Mary Westmacott in some ways. And it's when you can feel Christie really digging into the characters and just loving the characters. And you can feel that this book was written quickly in a good way. Like there's passion here, not just coming from Mike himself, but for all of these characters and for the way that they're interacting. And that's very much what she's doing in her Mary Westmacotts, where it's just about what drives people and much less about the mystery of a murder or anything like that. Even though we have that here, she's doing it all. We're really getting the best of a Mary Westmacott in this book. And again, I say that as a huge recommendation.
I would agree with you, but I would say is we know that by this point she was dictating these. She was not writing them. And while that kind of has failed, I think we talked about this in like probably the last 2 novel episodes. In this case, it works incredibly to her advantage.
Yeah,
so
agreed.
Anyway, Mike and Ellie agree to get married. They hire Santa Nix to build this super, super modern house in place of the old sort of shambling Victorian. He's dying, so it's going to be his last hurrah, probably. So he wants to make this like his masterpiece.
Meanwhile, Ellie is getting threatened by Mrs. Lee, the quote-unquote local gypsy. She sneaks off to try to make friends with Mike's mother because she just doesn't think it's right that she marry Mike and not meet his mother. This goes back to just her base level goodness and sweetness of character. She just can't abide not meeting the mother-in-law. She also makes friends with Claudia Hardcastle, who's another horsey person. They love riding horses together. She makes friends with Major Philpott. She makes friends with everyone, essentially, because she's just a nice person. And she's also got lots of money. That never hurts. The only other thing that we should perhaps note here is that even though Ellie does love her horses, she has actually been allergic to them since she was a child. But because of these allergies, when she does go out and ride, she has to take this allergy medicine, which comes in the form of these giant capsules that she
I think I have
swallows.
To take those currently, Kemper. And so anybody who wants to talk about like my rasp, welcome to Los Angeles, folks.
Yeah, Los Angeles, not so good for allergies.
Not so good.
All right. Well, what happens next, Catherine?
Well, so she's getting hounded by her family because now they find out that she has been secretly married. And that's not cool. And, you can see why it would probably not be cool in general. But Ellie just wants her pretty new house and her handsome husband, and she wants to be left alone.
Yeah, and by the way, lest we think that Ellie be too annoyingly sweet and simple, I appreciated the fact that when Mike calls Cora double-faced bitch, that would be one of his many uses of the word. He'll use it a lot more. And then he apologizes, saying, perhaps I oughtn't to say that. Ellie responds, why not, if that's what you think? I expect you're not far wrong. So she definitely does not like Cora, nor are we meant to like Cora. But eventually, Ellie invites Greta, who, is a character often referenced for the first half of the book, but who we don't actually see for quite a while. But she finally does show up. And, Mike describes her, and she is indeed beautiful. She's very Nordic. She looks like a Valkyrie. Unfortunately, Greta and Mike appear to hate each other. They get into arguments. Each of them is possessive over Ellie, it seems. Greta wants to care for her. Mike is Ellie's husband. And it's, an interesting situation all around.
And poor Ellie is caught in between. She originally calls Greta because she sprains her ankle, right? And so she does need to be taken care of, and she misses her best friend.
Gee, Catherine, it's almost as though these 3 people were stuck in some sort of a triangular kind of relationship. But
you don't say.
I don't know.
Side eye. Ellie's ankle heals. She goes out horse riding after taking her allergy medication, obs. And Mike spends that time going out to lunch with Major Philpott.
Yeah, well, she's supposed to meet them for lunch, right? And she doesn't show up. And Mike's like, well, that's not very much like Ellie. And they sort of get increasingly nervous and worried. And it does not end well, does it, Catherine?
No, because her beautiful white face is found staring into the distance in a ditch by the Major. And it seems like maybe she's been thrown from her horse, but by the time the Major touches her, it's clear she's been pretty long dead.
There's some talk of maybe she had a weak heart. That's something that Greta mentions, actually, at the inquest. And Mike then is just embroiled in all sorts of red tape, essentially, because it seems that Ellie, unbeknownst to him, actually made out a will after she was married, and he's inherited everything. So Mike has to go to America to tie up some business matters having to do with Ellie's estate. While he's there, he finds out that Santonix actually is very much on death's door. He's in San Francisco at the time. So before Mike goes back to England, he visits Santonix where he dies. But first, he finds the strength to yell at Mike, "You should have gone the other way." And Mike is like, huh?
Right.
And he also finds out that Claudia Hardcastle has actually died in the interim, also seemingly thrown from her horse, and, a very similar death to what happened to Ellie. So that is curious. He has this cryptic final meeting with Uncle Andrew Lippincott, in which Greta comes up. Mike tells him that Greta is still living at Gypsy's Acre and how he's really come to rely on her. And Uncle Andrew's basically like, that's interesting. By the way, I wrote you a letter, which I'd love for you to open up when you get back to Gypsy's Acre in England. And if I were Mike, I would have been like, could you just tell me what's in the letter now? But he's like, cool. I'll get to that letter and I'm going to go home now. And before Mike approaches the threshold of Gypsy's Acre and we get to the world as it actually is, I think we actually do, even though this is not a traditional or proper puzzle mystery, we do have a couple of Christie-ish clues to bridge us on over. I will take the first one, our clue number one, which involves Mrs. Lee, actually, our quote-unquote gypsy lady, because it's interesting. In the very beginning of the story, she warns Mike to stay away from Gypsy's Acre. And this happens as she's reading his palm. Again, she's a fortune teller. She says, if you know what's good for you, you'll get out of Gypsy's Acre here and now, and you won't come back. Because if you do, you'll come back to sorrow and loss and danger, maybe. There's trouble, black trouble waiting for you. Forget you ever saw this place. I'm warning you. And okay, while I was reading this, obviously this is a reread and I know what's going to happen, so I was primed for this, but I really did immediately think of the novella Triangle at Rhodes. So fast forward if you haven't yet read Triangle at Rhodes, but there's a great moment in that story where Poirot actually warns Marjorie Gold, one of the very few characters in that novella, another love triangle story of Christie's. He warns her, leave this place at once if you value your life. And this is basically a more extreme version of what Mrs. Lee is doing here, because the assumption is that the person being warned is in some sort of danger coming to them from the outside. But sometimes the warning is actually about the danger that the person being warned is themselves bringing into the situation. And it's one of those kind of flip it and reverse it things where Christie is, taking our assumptions and flipping them on our heads. These people are being warned not because they're in danger, but because they are danger.
Yep.
And Poirot is warning Marjorie Gold because she's on the precipice of going through with her murderous plot. And he's begging her not to. And, perhaps we have something similar going on here. I don't know. Just a thought.
Well, and leading into that, clue number 2, love triangles, Kemper.
Oh, boy.
As our friend John Curran puts it, the seemingly impregnable alibis of a pair of murderous adulterers. And so, try not to be spoilery, but we have Mysterious Affair at Styles, we have Death on the Nile, we have Evil Under the Sun, we have Five Little Pigs, and do we maybe see it here? Christie tends to do the same thing. It's 2 women and 1 man. And, our deduction is if you have 2 heavily featured women and 1 man, especially when that dude is married to one of those ladies. Maybe we should be a little suspicious as to whether appearances can be trusted. So is there something more going on in terms of the relationship dynamics?
All right, clue number 3, and this is Mike's mother, Mrs. Rogers. And I think this is worth bringing up because Christie really plays fair here. And it's startling if we reread these passages after we know the truth. To wit, Mrs. Rogers is described as looking at her son, quote, with fear in her eyes. So the deduction there is that, like Kevin, we need to talk about Mike, and we will be talking a lot about Mike.
Clue number 4, and it's more Agatha cleverness and playing fair, because when Mike meets Greta for the first time in the story, he says, I couldn't help feeling a bit awkward. I'm not always very good at acting a part. Later, he refers to being glad when Greta returns to London because her staying there had been a strain on me. And it's a little bit weird, maybe, that Mike seems to not want to talk about Greta in the narrative, given that it's first person and she is so important to the plot with Ellie. It's a little weird that he doesn't want to talk about her.
Forgive me for making this analogy again on the podcast, but it's a little bit like when Andrew Lincoln goes out of his way not to have anything to do with Keira Knightley in Love Actually.
But you never talk to me. You don't like me.
And of course, the secret is because he's in love with her. So I don't know. Maybe we have something similar going on here. Maybe he's going to be at her doorstep with cue cards telling her about his undying love for her. Maybe that's how Endless Night ends.
That would be the nice version, wouldn't it?
It would be a little bit more nice than the way that the book actually ends. Yes. I'm actually like really imagining Mike Rogers now with like cards being like, Greta. Okay, so please fast forward for clue number 5 if you haven't yet read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. But seriously, just stop this recording and read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd right now, because you really need to if you've gotten this far into this episode, because you will just have the time of your life. But this is a very, very meta Christie clue, because Christie, of course, as we noted, has lots of first-person male narrators. She's not shy of inhabiting a man and telling a story from his point of view. But whenever we have a first-person narrator in any story, be it Christie or, say, Daphne du Maurier, for example, we should be suspicious of the skewing of perspective, right, that happens when we have a first-person narrator. You know, we all read Gone Girl as well, for example. You know, this is a tried and true trope of the thriller genre and every genre. So we would just do well to be careful about taking anything that our first person narrator says at face value. And of course, you know, we know that Christie tricked us hard in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd as to this. She made the narrator the murderer in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. She couldn't possibly do that again, though, right? I mean, there's no way for her to do that idea a second time, but kind of reinvent it and make it brilliant again. I mean, that just wouldn't be possible.
Can I pull a Ferris Bueller and break the fourth wall and stare at the camera here?
Oh, and then Catherine, can I just take clue number 6?
Yeah, go for it.
As well, because this is a favorite clue of mine. This is a really slight point. We don't even really have to mention it all that much in our resolution, but there's a random folly on Mike and Ellie's property that they spend time in. It's mentioned tangentially at best. But the deduction, because this is going to come up actually in 2 more Christies that we haven't yet covered, the deduction is show me a folly in a Christie novel, or more broadly, show me any sort of exterior garden or like woodsy outdoor structure that's showcased however slightly in the course of the mystery, and I will show you some murderous hijinks. Like something is going to be important about either the structure itself or what happens inside of the structure. And, you know, without getting too specific, we saw that in Dead Man's Folly. And again, in 2 books yet to come, Halloween Party and Nemesis, we will see this again. I'm trying to connect Endless Night, the outlier, to the Christie oeuvre as much as I can. And I think that's one of the ways that
it's just that Kemper hates gazebos.
I have like a gazebo-phobia. It's like my version of the woodshed in Cold Comfort Farm.
There's something nasty in the gazebo.
What is our final clue, Catherine?
Well, hi. Does someone in this novel take compounded allergy medications that are in easily broken apart capsules? Yeah, someone does. And let's just say, probably Ellie didn't fall from that horse because she couldn't ride the horse.
We haven't mentioned it in quite a while, but it's certainly a lot easier to put a noxious substance into a capsule that breaks apart like that than it is, say, to stuff 50 Advil into a chocolate, which we saw Christie use as a murderous ploy.
Although I want everybody to note that I did post this on Instagram, that I was recently in a Victorian pharmacy and they had chocolate-coated strychnine capsules. And I was very delighted.
Should we ever get the chance to rewrite The Chocolate Box, that Poirot short story, maybe we would insert some chocolate-covered strychnine in there instead of the very, very crunchy bonbons.
I know. Yeah, it's more
story.
like the problem with that short story is, would nobody notice chewing through that?
I like a crunchy Snickers bar as much as the next fellow, but yeah.
You like them filled with painkillers?
Let's get to The World as It Actually Is, which I'm going to be honest is a horror show, because the veil gets lifted here. We are not reading a romance. We are reading a down and out horror novel, and things get dark real quick.
Yeah. Mike returns to Gypsy's Acre when he comes back from the United States, and he meets up with Greta, which we know that he's going to do. He's already informed Mr. Lippincott that, he's been relying on her.
Could I just read the section when he comes back to Gypsy's Acre and he sees Greta and he meets up with her? Because what I find so devastating about this is the quietness of the confession, the modesty of it almost. He never even says, you got me, I did it, or anything like that. All he says is, the sun had set when I came up the road to Gypsy's Acre. I told Greta the time I'd arrive. She was up there in the house waiting for me. At last. We'd done with subterfuges now and all the pretenses, the pretense of disliking her. I thought now, laughing to myself, of the part I'd played, a part I'd played carefully right from the beginning. Disliking Greta, not wanting her to come and stay with Ellie. Yes, I'd been very careful. Everyone must have been taken in by the pretense. I remembered the quarrel we'd faked up so that Ellie should overhear it. And then we go on from there. He just spills the beans with little to no fanfare. And it's alarming because this is a psychopath.
Oh, this is not good.
Well, for a while, it seems to go great, right? Because Greta is there and she's so beautiful and she smelt and looked and tasted of sex. We denied ourselves so long, except for occasional brief meetings up in the Folly. I told you stuff was going on in that Folly, folks. I came straight into her arms, a sailor home from the sea to where he belonged. Yes, it was one of the most wonderful moments of my life. But then he opens up Uncle Andrew's letter, doesn't he?
Yeah. And guess what? Uncle Andrew, who has actually seemed very smart. I know that we listed him as a suspect early on, but Uncle Andrew has seemed pretty savvy this entire narrative. So what did he send? He didn't send a long letter. He just sent one thing, didn't he? The photograph in Hamburg. And it's Greta and Mike together.
Them together
and it was
years
from
ago.
Years ago.
I don't know if it was years ago because this has been such a whirlwind romance, right? But it was certainly before Mike had met Ellie. So it shows this was obviously a plot between the two of them to hoodwink Ellie out of her fortune and life.
Yeah, so they needed money. And Greta told him that she was the companion to this rich American heiress, and that the easiest and fastest way for them to get money would be to take this sweet girl, and that he should marry her, and they'd kill her, and they would steal her fortune. And, once he sees the picture, as Greta's like pouring some champagne to celebrate their success, what does he do, Kemper?
Well, let's just say that things devolve really quickly.
Very quickly, let's say.
Christie, I think, conveys the way in which he falls apart and his true psychotic nature just is brought out. We learn all of this basically as this cascade of information
at the very end of the novel.
Very, very end of the book, because what he says is, and this is where we're getting a lot of the use of that word bitch as well. He writes, I could never have hated Ellie, but I hated Greta. I enjoyed hating her. I hated her with all my heart and with a leaping, joyous wish. I couldn't wait for the Safeways. I didn't want to wait for them. I came nearer to her. You filthy bitch, I said. You hateful, glorious, golden-haired bitch. You're not safe, Greta. You're not safe from me. Do you understand? I've learned to enjoy killing people. I was excited the day that I knew Ellie had gone out with that horse to her death. I enjoyed myself all the morning because of killing, but I've never gotten near enough to killing until now. This is different. I want more than just knowing that someone's going to die because of a capsule they swallowed at breakfast time. I want more than pushing an old woman over a quarry. I want, and this is in italics, to use my hands. And then he fastens his hands around her neck, and this chapter ends with him saying, yes, it's wonderful to do. Yes, I was wonderfully happy when I killed Greta. ...
Well, and we also find there's this story that he tells much earlier that he's like very heartbroken about how he had a childhood best friend who had fallen through the ice. Mm-hmm. And how upset he had been, etc. And we find out in this last cascade that, oh no, the kid did fall through the ice. That did happen. But then Mike saw that the kid had a watch that he wanted. So he went to go reach for the kid's hand. He grabbed the watch off of it, and then he held the kid's head underneath the ice. And he had another friend who had been stabbed. He didn't do it, but the kid had all these betting chits. Mm-hmm. And he realized, oh, well, he could just take all of them. So then he took the knife that was stuck in his ostensible best friend, stabbed the kid another few times, and took the gambling chits. He's a psychopath.
He's a psychopath. And then it gets even more horrifying because he's just sitting there with Greta's dead body. And eventually Major Philpott comes and Dr. Shaw, who's a local doctor, and they're asking him all these questions. He lets out a, quote, queer little giggle. So now we are truly in, I think, as you put it, Catherine, towards zero / taken at the flood sort of land in terms of just we won't be more specific than that, but just the horrifying lifting of the veil of the murderer, particularly towards zero. It actually put me in mind of Sunset Boulevard, actually, when things just really completely fall apart at the end of that. And there's just that really sad and horrifying, but gloriously horrifying ending where you're just like, oh, wow. This has...
No, I mean, I do think there's an argument to be made both here and in Sunset Boulevard that they know what they're doing. I mean, I think that, there's this sort of interpretation of Sunset Boulevard. Fast forward if you don't want to know the ending of Sunset Boulevard, but there's a reading of Sunset Boulevard that Norma Desmond wanted the attention. She didn't want to go out a nobody. Mm-hmm. She wanted the attention back. And so that's why she kills Joe in Sunset Boulevard.
She's going to be famous and she wants to be famous again. She's happy.
And
she's happy at the end. And he is too. He's actually sort of happy. It also puts me in mind of Norman Bates, of course, at the end of Psycho. I mean, Norman Bates too. Sure. Here's the thing. I actually have a memory, and it only just came to me as we were having this discussion, but I remember all the way back in our Mysterious Affair at Styles discussion on our first episode. Fast forward if you haven't read Mysterious Affair at Styles, but I remember talking about the fact that, wow, the situation that you have here, this adulterous pair, the husband and this other woman who's his cousin, they're, very much having sex on the side, and they conspire to murder the man's wife, right? This older woman, Emily Inglethorpe. I remember saying there's such a different way to tell that story if you wanted to, where you could focus on the sex and the tawdriness and the darkness of what's happening, but Christie didn't choose to tell that story, The Mysterious Affair of Styles. Well, you know what? Christie's still writing almost 50 years later, and she has chosen to, in her own way, tell that dark and sort of tawdry version of the story. And she's pulling it off so well because she's writing at the end of the 60s, and she's writing a psychological thriller that fits into the contemporary landscape. And it's the same story, or a very similar story. And, you know, as we've already mentioned, very similar to what happens in Death on the Nile, of course, as well.
Right, of course.
But she's telling it totally differently. And this, too, this is yet another example I can now point to when people bring up that old chestnut of, well, Christie's good at plots, but not anything else. It's like the plot here isn't the point because she did the plot before, but the way that she brings this plot to life with these specific characters and the world in which they live in 1967 is so good and so expertly crafted and rendered. That's why this book is brilliant. It has nothing to do with the plot, which is a great plot. Don't get me wrong, but she did it before many times over. But this is still brilliant. She's using all of her old tricks, but she's reinventing them brilliantly. And the fact that she could do that, not even given how old she was or anything, because who cares that she was that old, but the fact that she could even just do that, reinvent herself for the umpteenth time, is amazing to me this late in her career.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I will reiterate my other point that I made earlier, that I think that the fact that she was dictating this and that it's first person makes it sing.
Because she nailed the voice.
Yeah, she nailed the voice. So, I mean, just to summarize, to sum up the plot, they poisoned Ellie with cyanide in the allergy capsules, and Claudia also took one. So they both were poisoned with cyanide. Cyanide
that was used on the wasps, which again is so classic Christie, right? It's like, oh, more of the poisons in the gardening shed.
Yep.
You know? Yep. We're still in a Christie here. And of course, Claudia Hardcastle, who died the same way. The reason we're told that she died is that she picked up one of the cyanide capsules that Mike and Greta had been preparing in that folly, because that's where they were doing all their devious things. And that she picked that up, which is also why there was a cigarette lighter with the letter C on it that had been picked up in the folly, which was Claudia's name. So you will not be shocked to learn that all of those details were added after the fact. And those were some of the whodunit-ish elements that Christie was forced to add to her tight psychological thriller of a manuscript, because Collins said, well, let's just try to fudge it and make it a little bit more of a whodunit. And there are a couple of more of those. Also, interestingly, Mrs. Lee, actually, because again, in that final confession, Mike essentially tells us that he pushed her over a quarry. As John Curran points out, if you parse out how and when Mrs. Lee was killed, it doesn't completely make sense.
No, it doesn't.
And in the original manuscript, she wasn't killed, actually. We don't necessarily know what happened to her, but it doesn't really matter. You know, in Third Girl, we talked about the fact that at this point in her career, perhaps it was difficult to give Christie any notes because she was such an institution, and no one really needed to, because her books were going to sell 1 million copies no matter what. But apparently that wasn't really the case, and Collins was still going to give her notes. I mean, hey, I wish they had given more notes on Third Girl if they were going to note her on something like Endless Night, or rather that they just didn't give her any notes on Endless Night, because I think her instincts on this one were just dead on, because she was so in sync with this book that just clearly poured out of her. So in the original version, by the way, Claudia had just been given one of the capsules by Ellie because they both had allergies and they both liked to ride horses. That was it. It was as simple as that. And like just this stupid complication that kind of adds this intrigue of like, oh, a cigarette lighter with a C on it, which is very Murder on the Orient Express, et cetera, was just added to it. So again, that's a minor criticism of, you know, some of the loose-ish ends that do exist when we finish this book. But for the most part, we're really not thinking about that, because our jaw has just dropped in horror and surprise at what Mike has done and who he is.
You know, in a lot of ways, I think that we like both Toward Zero and Taken at the Flood, which is why I brought them up to you before we recorded this. But, you know, Toward Zero has a bonkers ending.
And Taken at the Flood has a bonkers ending that has nothing to do with the puzzle mystery, which is a very, very upsetting depiction stuck in its time.
Right.
For what we're meant to take out of it. But yes.
This book has a bonkers ending that actually makes all the sense in the world.
It makes all the sense in the world, and it ages really well.
Frighteningly so. I have to tell you, as a woman, frighteningly so.
I mean, this felt like a relevant book for 2021, just as relevant, I imagine, as it felt in 1967.
Yes. This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
Catherine, I'm so curious. What exactly is the driving force behind your ongoing love affair with Howie the Lizard? What is it that makes you two tick?
I mean, he does have a magic wand, but the secret is that we keep it fresh, of course, because there's always a new level to tackle, a new puzzle to solve, a new slug to defeat, a new beautifully designed landscape in which to luxuriate with my love as we while away the minutes, or hours if we're feeling frisky. But that's also the great thing about Best Fiends. You can dip in and out of it with ease for as long or as short a time as you want. Howie doesn't mind. No muss, no fuss.
Well, now that really does sound like the ideal relationship. So engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. This might be taking things a little far given what we know about Christie's biography, but I was just in my mind comparing it to the scenario in Death on the Nile. So again, if you haven't read Death on the Nile, fast forward. But
I think by the way, I think Death on the Nile is it's an appropriate reference to this.
No, I mean, as we mentioned, when we were doing the clues, there are a lot of novels that feature love triangles, but I think in a lot of ways, the love triangle of Death on the Nile is the closest to what we have here. But even between those two, I think there are some key differences. And interestingly, in Death on the Nile, the way that she treats Jacqueline and Simon's love for each other, there is a sympathetic quality to their portrayal, though they are ultimately horrendous murderers, where their relationship ends up being intact at the end of the novel from where it was at the beginning. And I remember theorizing, in a way that's a little bit of a wish fulfillment thing coming from someone whose first husband cheated on her. And so in Death on the Nile, the dream, in a way, is that the original couple is always faithful to each other. And even though this rich heiress, this brilliant, wonderful woman swoops in, she doesn't actually swoop in, and she never actually broke up the original relationship. We technically have the same situation here, but
right.
It is so reversed in terms of the characters. There is no sympathy for Greta and Mike, because when they get together, they're immediately doing it for nefarious purposes. And it just, to me, feels like Christie is over the Archie Christie thing. I mean, I actually think she never really got over it, probably. And I also will never know, because I'll never be able to get inside her head on this. But it just feels like she has moved on as a writer anyway. But we should discuss the two adaptations that exist in the English language. And the first of them, I think we'll probably be discussing a little bit longer than the second, because the first is the major one. And this is the movie that came out in 1972, just 5 years after the publication of the novel. It stars Hayley Mills, Miss Disney herself, as Ellie.
Eklund.
The Welsh actor, very appropriate given the Welsh origins of this story, the Welsh actor Hywel Bennett as Mike Rogers, and then Britt Eklund herself as Greta. And this was produced by British Lion. It was filmed in the summer of 1971. It was released in October of 1972. And just a little bit of background, which of course you all know I'm getting from Mark Aldrich and Agatha Christie on screen, because this isn't a little bit of an outlier as a film adaptation of Christie given when it was released. This is before those big splashy 70s Christie adaptations, Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. By the mid-60s, most of the rights to Christie properties were either tied up already or they were being held firmly in reserve by Christie herself and her estate due to her horror over, the film and television world in general. And of course, the main culprit of that were those pesky MGM films, which we've talked at great length about. But Endless Night, the novel, came along in 1967, and it was a fresh property, which meant that it was available. And I'm going to quote from Mark, because I think he's absolutely right here. The nature of the story made it a particularly strong candidate for a British film of this period. Christie had, wittingly or unwittingly, written a drama well suited to the style of many successful films of the late 1960s and offered up a strong psychological thriller. And for once, Christie played ball, and the result is this film that feels very much like a 70s thriller, for better or worse. And sometimes it is better, and sometimes it's worse. We open up
very weird soundtrack.
It's a very so this is what's fascinating too. I mean, there are a lot of Hitchcock influences here. First of all, the writer-director of this movie is Sidney Gilliat, who co-wrote the screenplay for The Lady Vanishes, podcast favorite Hitchcock film. That was all the way back in 1938. So Sidney Gilliat was quite a veteran when he was doing this movie in 1967. But even more significantly, the score is by Bernard.
Yeah, Psycho. Yeah.
He did Psycho. He did North by Northwest. This score is also very strings heavy. Right in the beginning, the opening credits, there are these waves crashing on the rocks in time with the swells of the music. And I was already like, okay, wow, this is going to be very melodramatic. The music goes like a little trippy at the end. It kind of has these Twilight Zone-y, otherworldly effects. It gets a little goofy 70s. The other moment, I think, where that's notable is when the architect in the movie, Santonix, he shows Mike and Ellie the house that he's built. And he has this like remote control he keeps pressing to move all these different things. And there's like a retractable floor with a pool in the middle and like a wall that turns around, and it's a wall of plants. And it all looks a little Willy Wonka from the 70s movie. It's like a little clunky, a little goofy. And Ellie at the time is also wearing like a scarf in her ponytail, very Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I guess everyone, that was just a look back then, right? Where you'd wear the scarf and the ponytail thing.
It's all
a
bad
very
look.
Dated.
I'm going to just say.
I actually kind of like it. Can we bring that back?
I would be happy to.
We know that Christie herself did not like the film. She said it had a very unpleasant scene, which was written at the end, which was very unnecessary. I mean, the bit where the other woman is strangled. It made it into a really horrible scene. Well, that, of course, I didn't like. And then apparently when Max said that he thought the photography of the film was good, Agatha said, I think otherwise. And it even took her a month to see it because she was so scared to see it because she just had such horrible relationships with the adaptations of her novels. I think she was being a little bit hard on it. I don't think it's abjectly terrible. And it's very faithful, actually, to the novel. And it's very faithful to her original conception of the novel, too, because it is really not billed as a whodunit. It very much feels like this quasi-romantic-ish thing that then goes horrible very quickly and has, surreal pop art imagery overlaid and all sorts of trippy sound effects and visual effects. And I think it did a fair job of capturing what she did in the novel, actually.
I kind of like it. The music to me was a bit much, I think.
This is something that Mark also picked up on, but there is some thick sexual tension between Santonix and Mike in this film. Santonix kind of seems to really want him bodily. It's a little weird.
He kind of does in the book. Am I wrong about that? I mean, I kind of got that reading in the book, too.
Agreed. I think that they made a choice that is absolutely warranted, given the text. They just went further with it. There are a couple of other scenes where I think they were making the point that, what is going on exactly with Mike's sexuality, which was interesting. But I also think that we should just applaud them for the casting of Hayley Mills as Ellie, because I just have to go a little bit on a Hayley Mills rant. I mean, she's such a weird vestige of old Hollywood because she had this quasi studio deal with Disney, right? Like she didn't actually have a studio deal like they did in like the 30s and 40s, but she did 6 movies in a row with Disney, starting when she was 13 in 1959. Of course, the one we all know is The Parent Trap in 1961, where she played twins. She was the last child to win a special juvenile Oscar for Pollyanna in 1960.
Yes, I've seen all. I just want everybody to know that for who knows what reason, I've seen all of the Haley Mills Disney movies as a child. You know, you could get a VHS tape at the library like in the 90s, and they must have just had all of them. So I have seen all of them.
And she's really good. She also didn't really crash and burn as so many child actors do. I mean, she never achieved the success of her juvenile career, but she absolutely hung in there. I mean, let us never forget Good Morning, Miss Bliss, the precursor to Saved by the Bell, in which she plays their teacher for the first 13 episodes of that series. She was also in the Peter Ustinov Appointment with Death, which we talked about when we covered that novel. And I find this really fascinating, by the way. I did not know this little tidbit until I was doing a little research on her for this episode. But did you know that she was offered the role of Lolita in Kubrick's film, but her father turned it down for her, much to her chagrin, apparently. After watching the movie, she was like, I wish I had been in it. It was really good.
It is really good. And that is fascinating. I actually did not know that.
I didn't either. I mean, that would have been very interesting. But she's the perfect victim here because her persona is a very Ellie-ish already, right? And she's heartbreakingly young in this. She looks so young. I wish that the song that they composed for that Blake poem was a bit catchier. I mean, I'll personally always prefer Let's Get Together.
Ooh-wee. And if you stick with me, nothing could be great to say, hey, alligator, let's get together, yeah.
From The Parent Trap. You know, the duet she sings with herself. Oh, yes.
Oh, boy.
But yeah, I mean, I think she's good. I think Hywell Bennett, by the way, this was her 3rd movie that she was in with Hywell Bennett, who plays Mike, so they actually knew each other quite well. I think he also acquits himself pretty well. Britt Eklund is kind of an appropriate choice. She's a blonde bombshell, right? To play Greta. Let's, not forget that she was married to Peter Sellers at this time.
Right.
They would be divorced soon after this film, I believe. Their marriage kind of crashed and burned, but it was a famous one. Interestingly, the movie didn't really do very well, though. And it actually did not receive a wide release in the U.S., which I find pretty surprising, given how popular Christie was. A little bit of a mixed bag, but I think that for people who really love the novel, I don't think you will be mad watching that movie. You might be a little more mad watching the second English language adaptation that we have of Endless Night. That would be the final episode, the very last episode of the very last season/series of the ITV Agatha Christie's Marple program. So this is Julia McKenzie, who's playing Miss Marple. It aired on the 29th of December, 2013. Apparently, Julia McKenzie wanted to do more, but as Matthew Pritchard told our good friend Mark, they were running out of stories by then. And I'd argue that we've got a perfect case in point of that here, because why did they do Endless Night as a Miss Marple story? I'm not sure.
Weird choice.
It's really, really weird. It's obviously weird because Endless Night is not a traditional murder mystery. It's not a whodunit. As Mark says, in this screen adaptation, the young couple at the center of the mysterious events may reasonably be expected to point the finger of blame at the old woman who seems to be stalking them, even going so far as to popping up on their honeymoon. Miss Marple herself. The insertion of Miss Marple into this story really stretches credulity. And it's especially bizarre because Mike actually voiceovers the whole episode. And it's just like, this is not a Miss Marple story. Like, it doesn't feel like a Miss Marple story. Sometimes they did a better job of shoehorning Miss Marple into these non-Marple stories that they decided to adapt. But it's just really, really bizarre, especially given the fact, and we haven't discussed this yet, and we're not going to discuss it at great length, actually, but we should note that there is a precursor to Endless Night very specifically that Christie wrote decades earlier, and that is, in fact, a Miss Marple short story. It's The Case of the Caretaker, and we actually haven't covered it yet, and that is by design, because we didn't want to cover it before we covered Endless Night, since it would completely spoil Endless Night, because it is literally the same story.
Right.
I mean, down to quote-unquote gypsies and building a house and the whole thing. So we're actually going to cover that short story in our next episode, because I think it'll be remarkable to see, you know, what Christie did. And now that the cat's out of the bag as to the plot, we can finally cover that story. So we'll be discussing that in greater detail on our next episode. But why not just adapt The Case of the Caretaker if you wanted to do a Miss Marple version of Endless Night? Because it literally exists. It just doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, well, there's also this like weird thing. We didn't mention this when we were talking about the plot, but it turns out that Santonix is actually the brother of Claudia Hardcastle in the book.
Yes.
It comes up kind of late.
It's another bit of intrigue that's, I think, meant to highlight the whodunit-ish aspect of the book, because perhaps it gives Claudia Hardcastle some sort of a motive to kill Ellie so that she can take their house at the end, because she wants it because her brother built it. It doesn't really make sense.
No,
it's very half-hearted.
It's kind of just like glossed over by the end of the book, but then it gets weirder in the adaptation.
In the Agatha Christie's Marple adaptation, the Santonix character is not called Santonix because he's actually British, and he's the brother of the boy who Mike pushed under the ice. I mean, to be honest, it's not the worst change, because it at least brings him more squarely into the plot. And at the end, though, speaking of Rebecca, then this adaptation gets really Rebecca, because he sets the house on fire.
I know, very Manderly. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike killed his brother because he finds the watch in his desk. Just like has it sitting in a drawer. I also found in this adaptation, the reveal of the house is very underwhelming. I was like, oh, that's the house? No.
I know. I kind of think the house has to be like great.
Neither of these adaptations nailed the house.
No.
I think you could almost justify a third adaptation of Endless Night for purposes of finally doing justice to Gypsy's Acre, the estate. This is one where actually I think it is ripe for a modern day adaptation. Because again, this story is relevant. I think it says so much about where we are now, and it will continue to say that. Because again, this is a Mary Westmacott-ish kind of story. This is about character and very fundamental dynamics as to class and other sort of elemental human desires and designs. And I think it'll always be relevant. And I think someone could do a pretty smashing adaptation. I mean, dare I say this? I'm almost surprised that Sarah Phelps hasn't gotten her hands on Endless Night.
Yeah, it's weird that they didn't put it as one of them, because you would think that would have seemed to be an obvious choice.
She doesn't, I mean, can you imagine that final sequence in Sarah Phelps's hands? Oh boy. But like, why did they choose to do The Pale Horse and not Endless Night?
Well, I mean, we love The Pale Horse.
I mean, we love The Pale Horse, but we do not love that adaptation of The Pale Horse.
Maybe the estate didn't want to do it.
In any case, I think that both of these are flawed. Again, the 1972 adaptation is, I think, less flawed and probably more interesting than the Agatha Christie's Marple adaptation. But I should also note that a French language adaptation is planned for Endless Night in the third iteration of the French series. Oh, yes, Catherine.
Please
here it comes. Are you ready?
Please do it. Yes, please.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie.
Oh, man.
It just never fails.
Just
never
like
fails because it always fails.
Delights me every time.
So that is planned for 2021. So hey, you know what? We actually will be getting our fresh take on Endless Night. I will 100% be watching that as soon as it comes out, actually. Now, having watched a couple of adaptations for our Patreon account, I have a lot of appreciation for that series, and I will be very interested to see what they do with Endless Night.
Yeah, definitely so. They do an interesting job. Sometimes it's very surreal, but it's always
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I think we should move on over into the rankings for Endless Night. And this is going to be a very happy discussion, especially, as Catherine mentioned, compared to some of our more recent rankings of late career Christies, because this is excellent. And I think we should note that Christie herself identified Endless Night as, quote, my own favorite at present, in a letter that she wrote to a Japanese fan in 1972, detailing her favorite among her novels. She doesn't identify it in her autobiography, but for the most part, her autobiography was actually written, I believe, before Endless Night even came out. I think she had finished working on it by like the mid-60s, so perhaps that's why. It really did get a rapturous response among her contemporaries. I've fallen into a pattern of quoting Francis Iles, aka Anthony Barclay Cox, for pretty much every novel that we cover now, since he just has these great reviews that he did in The Guardian, and this one does not disappoint. This is what he wrote. The old maestrina of the crime novel, or whatever is the female of maestro, pulls yet another out of her inexhaustible bag with Endless Night, quite different in tone from her usual work. It is impossible to say much about the story without giving away vital secrets, sufficient to warn the reader that if he should think this is a romance, he couldn't be more mistaken, and the crashing, not to say horrific suspense at the end is perhaps the most devastating that this surpriseful author has ever brought off. And then we just get a little bit more from Christie biographer Janet Morgan, who tells us that Endless Night had some of the warmest notices Agatha Christie ever received, with praise from friends whose discrimination she particularly respected. John Sparrow, for instance, the Warden of All Souls, and Stephen Runciman, the historian. And then Christie's more recent biographer, Laura Thompson, actually expands on John Sparrow's reaction, because he was actually one of Max's very erudite friends. Mm-hmm. And Thompson writes, after the publication of Endless Night, Sparrow wrote to Agatha that he had read the book twice. I particularly relished a number of calculated ambiguities that I had missed before. He was impressed by the character of Michael, who narrates the book. His classlessness, or rather his between-classness, if I may put it so, and also his schizophrenia, or rather his practically dual personality, displayed especially in his ambivalent feelings about Ellie. Absolutely convincing. I agree with all those people. I think this book is just excellent, and I think it's excellent in all of these categories. And we've already talked, I think, a lot about the way that these categories are going to break down rankings-wise. The plot mechanics and plot credibility scores are going to be the lowest, relatively speaking. But again, I still think they should be high because we fully will admit that this is a recycled plot. And then some. I mean, it's recycled not only in terms of the love triangle from all of those novels that we mentioned, but in terms of the narrator as murderer trope, which is recycling from The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and even The Man in the Brown Suit. And then, of course, we also have this just being a plain old expansion of a Miss Marple short story, The Case of the Caretaker. And that was first published in January 1942, so 25 years earlier. And yet, look at what she did with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. You know, the mechanics, there's some confusing stuff slightly. So, you know, I mean, it's probably not going to get top marks there, I would say.
Yeah, this is where I think having those stray ends of the whodunit-ish elements, which, you know, even if Christie didn't want to put them in there, she agreed to it. So that's, you know, we have to judge the published manuscript. I think that is a slight ding. And then because it is a plot that we've seen before, that, you know, again, speaks to her brilliance, but not as to plot, right? Like as to setting, tone, characterization, which is why she's going to get such high marks in those other categories. But that also, I think, lowers the score slightly. I just have two other points points as to plotting overall in terms of mechanics and credibility. One is that comparing this novel to Crooked House, I think, is also instructive. So fast forward if you haven't read Crooked House, but it's worth noting, this is a point John Curran makes, that just as in the case of Crooked House, the notebooks show us, Christie's notebooks, that the shock ending was not the inspiration for the story. The ending actually came about in the course of Christie's plotting of the story. So we know from her notebooks that she did not start Crooked House from a place of, and now I'm going to do my The Child Did It story. And as John Curran writes, at no point in the notes for her last devastating surprise, Endless Night, is there mention of the narrator killer. It was not a case of thinking, I'll try the Ackroyd trick again, but this time with a working class narrator, and I'll begin with the meeting and courtship, which is all part of the plot, rather than after the marriage. Indeed, there is brief mention in Notebook 50 of one of the characters being a friend of Poirot, who was presumably to investigate the case, and at only one point is there mention of telling the story in the first person. The inspiration for the shock ending came to her as she plotted, rather than the other way round. And I just think it's important to keep that in mind, because I think that is one of the reasons why her plots end up being as good as they are, because she's not necessarily
she's working with what she's doing. So
exactly. She's not tricking us for the sake of tricking us. She's telling a story. And then she's just making the story as good as she possibly can and as tricky as she possibly can as she's telling it. So I think that's important.
I would have to say about this, I don't even think the story is tricky. It's just like smart at what it's doing.
It's true. It's a good point. It's less tricky than Ackroyd. Ackroyd is definitely,
Ackroyd is a puzzle mystery. And I mean, I have to say that while there are obvious similarities, that is a puzzle mystery. And while we went through clues in this one, they're not as relevant.
No, I mean, I think it actually probably is possible to solve Endless Night, but you're not meant to solve it. It's not written to be solved, as most Christies are.
It's meant to be read. It's not, we always have this conversation about how I'm a person who reads and who wants to know what happens. Like when we say spoiler alert, I've never fast forwarded through any spoiler alert on anything ever. I either try to puzzle it out for myself first, or I don't care because it doesn't matter to me. That's how I read. And this book is just meant to be read. I don't really think there's a spoiler here.
But Dr. Shepard is omitting key facts. And then at the end of the book, he even brings the reader through to say, did you see what I did there? Do you see how if I had separated those sentences with some asterisks, you might have realized that there was a missing 10 minutes, but you never knew. I tricked you. Mike doesn't do that. As I said, his moment of confession, he's just telling you what's happening. And then he says, yes, we tricked them all. We deceived them. But he's never bringing the reader into his subterfuge or sort of crowing about it the way Dr. Shepard does, but he does use the same technique. He omits. He never says, and this was the very first time I was meeting Greta and I had never met her before and I hated her. He doesn't outright lie, but he doesn't tell the truth. He massively omits key information.
Right.
At several points in the story. Yeah. So it's the same technique, but just a completely different kind of a book.
Absolutely.
Kind of a story.
And I would say that at least from the credibility perspective, it has to get a high score because actually, as we talked about earlier at length, it makes quite a bit of sense.
I agree. And that's why I think that plot credibility should get a slightly higher score than plot mechanics. And the point that I would make is just that I think among the pantheon of young and beautiful children of Lucifer, I'm using air quotes there. We had that at Bertram's Hotel. Among these horrible young people who Christie created in her later career, I'm thinking of Edward Goring in They Came to Baghdad, Elvira Blake in At Bertram's Hotel, David Baker in Third Girl. Those aren't spoilers, by the way, because I'm not necessarily by any means mentioning murderers there. I think that Mike Rogers is by far the most believable of any of those.
Oh, he's totally believable. That's why this book is actually like a little bit frightening.
I just want to quote from Laura Thompson. She makes the fine distinction that it's not about the accuracy of Michael's speech, it is the rendering of his thoughts. Agatha understood instinctively the creed of the late 20th century so inimical to her own, the sense of entitlement that leads people to believe that anything they want, they should be able to have. Mike Rogers is not merely a psychopath, he is a creature of his morally impoverished age, and Agatha, whose upbringing was steeped in ideas of duty and selflessness, realized him absolutely. She understood his charm, his casual urges, his rootlessness, his egotism, his belief that he can create his own destiny, and that achieving a desire is the same thing as fulfillment. The space where his soul should be is at the center of the book. A confusion of desire and desolation pervade endless night. And the other way I would put that is that this book literally covers all 4 of the L's identified by P.D. James as motivation for murder.
Yeah.
Love of Ellie, what she represents, lust of Greta, lucre, because he wants the cashola, he wants the house, and loathing of the upper classes, I'd say, and of restraint in any form whatsoever.
Right.
So, eminently believable.
And loathing of his own upbringing, I think.
Right, of his mother.
Yeah, hi, Norman Bates. So, yeah, I mean, I think I would go like 7 and 8.
I fully concur with a 7 for plot mechanics and an 8 for plot credibility. Then characters, I think this book also does quite well. I don't think it's Christie's absolute best because I don't think that every single character shines, but we've talked at great length as to what good characters Mike Rogers and Ellie are. I think she really nails both of those, and I think they're striking. You know, Janet Morgan said every character is interesting, particularly Santonix, a young dying architect with a touch of Vernon Lee from Giant's Bread. That is an early Mary Westmacott, which we haven't covered yet. So he's Vernon Lee from Giant's Bread, and Max's friend Esme Howard. Another is Michael Rogers, who dreams of Gypsy's Acre and of the house Santonix will build there. Into Rogers, Agatha put something of her feeling about Richard III, described in her wartime letters to Max, calling him, quote, an outlaw. And I just had to mention that because I think that's really funny, given that, oh yes, on our Patreon, we recently covered The Daughter of Time, which deals with the reputation that Richard III had, fairly or unfairly. Don't believe everything Shakespeare tells you, people, about Richard III. I'll just say that.
And also read Daughter of Time. It was a worthwhile reread.
Yeah, read Daughter of Time. As to Greta, I think you really can make the argument that it's quite purposeful that she's such a cipher and that she's barely on the page, because Mike is at first uncomfortable, with portraying her because he's hiding so much. And then at the end, he kills her and there's not much room for her. But I found it unsettling how little she was conveyed in the course of the story for such an important character.
I think it's deliberate. I think it's because he's a psychopath and he's a narcissist and she doesn't matter to him either. He's narrating.
No, I you know what? Benefit of the doubt, right? I think let's give Christie the benefit of the doubt on that.
I think that given that he's the narrator, and in fact, it actually says something weirdly sad about how Ellie is portrayed, because it seems like he loves her.
He does. To the extent that Mike Rogers is capable of love, he 100% loves Ellie. It's interesting. I think that there's a tinge of the ending to Five Little Pigs at the end of this novel. So fast forward if you haven't read Five Little Pigs, but in the same way that Elsa Greer says, I died, right? And Caroline and Ammius, they went somewhere where I couldn't access them. We have this really curious situation where Mike, as he's coming back to Greta, and it's supposed to be this triumphant moment at Gypsy's Acre, he sees Ellie, right? And this is what he says to Greta. He says, Ellie was there all right, looking quite happy, just like herself, as though she'd always been there and was always going to be there. She was looking for me and at me, but she couldn't see me. Greta, she couldn't see me. My voice rose. And I know why. I know why she couldn't see me. What do you mean? Asks Greta. It was then that I whispered for the first time under my breath, because that wasn't me. I wasn't there. There was nothing for her to see but endless night. Then I shouted out in a panic-stricken voice, some were born to sweet delight and some were born to endless night. Me, Greta, me. That gets a little silly, even for me by the end. But it's this idea that, Ellie's good. Ellie is dead. Ellie is inaccessible to one as dark and empty as Mike Rogers and Greta. They are fallen, and it's a very, very strong hint of Five Little Pigs at the end. And in the best of ways, right? Because that's one of the most powerful moments in all of Christie, is when Elsa Greer says that she died. Chapter
in Christie, in my opinion. So, I think that is definitely a compliment. This is an apologia, right? But like
a sneering apologia, but sure.
Yeah, but I think that what he's trying ultimately to say is actually that he did love her and that this was a mistake, but he can't escape himself.
We should circle back to that moment when Sansonik says you should have gone the other way. Because by the end of the novel, he, of course, understands exactly what he meant, which was there was this moment right after Ellie was singing the song with the William Blake lyrics. And she says to him, like, why are you looking at me like that? And he says, like how? And she says, like, you love me. And it's the one time when he is looking at her with real, true love. And in that moment, he could have made the choice to just forego the plot with Greta. And that's where also the comparison to Death on the Nile is so interesting, because it feels like there are moments like that too, because Simon is so weak, where he maybe would have just gone along with Lynette, and you can almost feel Jacqueline's anxiety over that. And it feels like it almost happens, and then it doesn't. And the same thing kind of happens here, which is that he ends up going along with his original plan just because he's too soulless.
No,
otherwise.
And I mean,
he couldn't rise to the occasion.
The interesting thing in comparison to Five Little Pigs, again, is Ammius does go the other way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what does it do? It gets him and his wife killed and their daughter shipped off to Canada.
You mean he's the only man within any of those love triangles who actually
makes the right decision.
Change. Yeah, who does make the right decision, and he becomes the victim for that reason. But yeah, and you know what? I've also answered my own question as to the characterization of Greta, because after all of that too, talking about how Ellie is inaccessible, he says about Greta, funny, after she was dead, I never thought of Greta much. After I'd killed her, she didn't seem to matter anymore. And you're absolutely right, Catherine. He's telling the story. He is literally sitting down and writing the story after having gone through the events of the story and having this kind of a perspective on Greta. So that's how he feels about Greta. She doesn't matter. He doesn't care.
Which is why
for all the sexiness and everything else, he doesn't care about her. That's why she's so absent.
I actually think that Christie's doing a really smart thing. I think that it's not fair to deduct points for Greta not being fleshed out solely because we have a first-person narrator who doesn't care.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. I mean, we're going to, I think, rank this very high. I think the only reason it's not getting, like, quite honestly, a 9 or a 10 is because a lot of those secondary and tertiary characters are, you know, fairly
major whatever.
Two-dimensional.
Yeah, they're not that interesting.
And it's a little jarring, like having to hear about Claudia Hardcastle in any way whatsoever is jarring in this book, because you're like, huh? What? Who?
No, I know. It's a little bit like every single time I was like, wait, who's Claudia Hardcastle again? like
I feel like I still right now don't completely remember who Claudia Hardcastle is. Like, this story is about 3 people and Santonix. That's it. And like maybe Mike's mother a little bit. She's also actually a very good character. But I also did think it was interesting. Robert Barnard made the point that you can see the real similarities in treatment of the American lawyers in Death on the Nile and here. And that suggests that she had been rereading Death on the Nile as she was writing.
No, that makes sense.
Which I think is probably true.
Yeah, I think it's true.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, it really, really has strong resonance of Five Little Pigs and Death on the Nile. Those would be the ones that I would probably point to, you know, and I mean, other than, of course, Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah. Oh, and one other thing I should mention here, because it kind of goes to continuity. I mentioned on our Pale Horse episode that the child buried behind the fireplace motif that we saw pop up there, and which we'll be seeing again very soon and very centrally in By the Pricking of My Thumbs. That's our next novel, actually. I mentioned that it appears in this novel. You may have noticed that you did not read any passage about that as you were reading the published version of Endless Night, and that's because it only appears in earlier unpublished versions. So apparently she had put in that section about a child buried behind the fireplace, but probably someone at Collins was like, didn't you already do that in The Pale Horse? And then she was like, oh yeah, and I'm actually going to make a whole novel out of that. So let's take that out. So that's why we were surprised to hear that it was in Endless Night, and we didn't remember it when I was talking about that in an earlier episode. So just FYI, it was an earlier version.
So I think we're going with 7 for a character.
I think that's fair. I think that sounds right. 6 would be too low, but I think 8 is a touch high. And of course, we'll just count that twice since there are no series-long characters. And then let's talk about setting and tone. It's fantastic. It's superlative. I mean, this book, as Christie so often is in her mysteries, this book is obsessed with real estate. Mike says Gypsy's Acre is the thing that mattered most to me. Funny that a house could mean that. It really is a central focus and a preoccupation of his throughout the novel.
Oh, absolutely. And there's like a big point made also that people are really upset that they tore down the old Victorian mansion and put up a modernist one. But then everybody goes in there and says, oh, you did a really tasteful job.
Yeah.
It's a fixation in this book is about the building of the house, about Ellie's building of the house, about the architecture of the house. It's a fixation, right?
Yeah, well, and I mean, a lot of ways too. I mean, this is Mike's way of social climbing as well. And I mean, that's also, I think, what's worth mentioning as a central theme of the novel. And Christie has handled this so deftly, I think, in so many previous books, and she does so here again, which is just an exploration of class and class differences. I mean, Mike says of him and Ellie, both of us were exploring a foreign country when he talks about the way that they learned about each other's lives. Like, that's how different their experiences were. And then I found this really fascinating. It's a little bit of a long quote, but it's his sort of meditation on what money does and the effect of money on someone's life and how it affects his life in an unexpected way. And I thought it was, again, such a perceptive point that Christie's making from the point of view of someone from the working class. He says, Ellie's world was a different world. It wasn't what I should have thought it to be. It wasn't just spending for spending's sake and showing off to everyone in sight. Instead, it was curiously simple, the sort of simplicity that comes when you get beyond the point of splashing for splashing's sake. Whatever you have is just the best of its kind, not so much because it is the best, but because there is no reason, if you like or want any particular thing, why you shouldn't have it. There's no moment when you say, I'm afraid I can't afford that one. So in a strange way, it makes sometimes for such a curious simplicity that I couldn't understand it. And I know exactly what he means. Yep. It's like that sweet spot of money where it's like money, of course, can complicate everyone's lives. And so often in fiction, it's used that way as a plot device, as a complication. And that's fair. But in reality, money kind of makes your life a lot easier. You know, it is simplifying in a way because you don't have to struggle as much and you don't have to choose. You know, the choices aren't as dire.
You don't buy the middling things that make you look like you're fancier than you are. You actually buy the fancy things. You have a suit tailored on Savile Row, you know?
Totally. And it is interesting that she's making that point, too, with a rich American heiress who's only a couple of generations into that wealth. She's not saying that this is someone who's blue-blooded for 18 generations and, you know, it's in her bones, her very bones, that she's privileged. It's not that. It's, you know, money buys you this sort of life of privilege, and she's lived with it her whole life. So now she's a young woman and she's grown up like that, and it's formed her character. And Mike grew up very much in need. And his mother was also a rather hard sort of person. She didn't, you know, she did obviously love him and she actually provided for him and did give him an education. I mean, that point is made several times.
But his grabbing of the watch sort of stuff, I just know adults who I don't think are psychopaths who treat stuff like that. Like they will push somebody else, I mean, metaphorically, under the ice for the watch when the watch is not going to make you look rich. It's just not. And everybody knows that. And I think that it's a fascinating thing because I think it is incredibly relevant to 2021.
Well, a little bit on that note, this is a novel in which taxation is mentioned a couple of times.
Oh, several times. Yes, I noticed.
3 times by my count. Mm-hmm. And I did, this was one of the few times where I raised my eyebrow at something that Christie was putting in Mike's mouth, because he says, that's one of the few nice things about being like me. Any money I make goes into my pocket and nobody can take it away from me. Like the idea of, you know, the wealthy and tax-hating Christie putting this in the mouth of her poor protagonist is potentially a little hard to swallow, but, you could just hear being like, at least when you're poor, you don't have to pay taxes.
Well, I know. And I mean, but people, I just like this struck such this chord because I think especially like in the last few years, it's just seemed to be such this issue and such this divide and there's such resentment. And it's just like, oh my God, get over yourself. As long as you can afford to live, then live your life.
But I mean, then that's the point, though. Mike is someone who he feels he's been denied the things that he wants and that he has decided that he needs. And he's going to do whatever he can to get them. And we know that Christie comes from such a different world, right? And that is in no way her viewpoint. But she's not making a straw man of him either. That's how well this book is written, that we understand his viewpoint by the end of, we certainly don't share it, or at least I didn't, especially when we get to the end of the novel, but she creates a convincing character so that you can understand what he's saying and where he's coming from and what he's feeling. And that's so powerful and that's so well done, especially knowing that she didn't really share that viewpoint and that, she was older and she came from, a background where it was about duty and giving back to the community and waiting your turn, putting many years in rather than saying at 22, I don't want to have to do a job and wait until, I believe at one point he says until I'm 40. Where he's like, I don't want to have to wait until I'm 40 to reap the rewards of my work. I want it now. And he has no patience and he's ruthless, but he's compelling. And I'm in awe of the fact that she was able to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that we should mention this because Matthew Pritchard mentioned this to us when we were talking to him last year for the International Agatha Christie Festival. But I think it is also useful sometimes to remember that Agatha was a faithful person. Because I do think that sometimes you get this sort of sense of, even though she obviously wrote totally about crime, she has a really nuanced sense of morality and what you should take from it. And I think that's probably partially informed by religion, and he's committing a betrayal, and that's actually the real crime here. Not just the murders, is that he takes somebody who has been loyal and faithful to him and he destroys her.
I think we've talked at this point a lot about how much we love what she did in terms of voice and point of view and exploring class and class differences. A couple of tiny little things. I appreciated that we have yet another Dickens reference in here.
I know, I noticed that. I knew that you would catch that too.
Yeah, he talks about Uriah Heep. Yep. He says, Uriah something his name was, always going on about being humble and rubbing his hands and actually playing and scheming behind that humility. Mike's determined not to be a Uriah Heep, so he's just going to wear it on his sleeve, his ambition. Before we give this a really high score, there's only one other time when Christie sort of loses me in Mike's narration, and it's toward the end when he says, but love, hate, desire, aren't they all the same? 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. I could never have hated Ellie, but I hated Greta. I enjoyed hating her. And to a certain extent, I think this is just sort of a fancy way of laying out a Madonna horror complex a little bit, which is also Mike seems to have. Again, that's a thing. That's a thing a lot of people still have. It's just a little trumped up and ridiculous. No, love, hate, and desire are not all the same. They're not 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah.
Where are you coming down on setting and tone, Catherine?
Probably 8 or a 9.
I think we should give it a 9. We've given a lot of 8s, but I think this deserves a tick above, and I think a 9 feels right.
Yeah, and then for Stuck in Its Time, I'm sorry, we have to take a point off for the gypsy thing.
In 1967, also, just to give Christie her full due here, People were using gypsy all over the place. It was actually only at the first World Romany Congress in 1971 that the term was unanimously rejected for its connotations of illegality and irregularity and for its use as a racial slur. It, of course, comes from this notion that the Romany people were from Egypt originally, which is not true. Based on linguistic and genetic evidence, it would seem to be the case that they actually come from the northern Indian subcontinent before dispersing and leading somewhat of a nomadic lifestyle. And to this day, their most concentrated populations are found in Europe, though interestingly, I did not know this, there are 1 million Romany people in the US and 800,000 in Brazil. Also, I think to give her credit, most of the quote-unquote gypsy shade is coming from characters. It's inside the mouths of characters. You know, Sergeant Keene, who's a local police officer, Major Philpott, they have some pretty bigoted views on the Romany people. But the word is just thrown all over the place. And I think, again, in that this category is depictions stuck in their time, it jars.
It's a name of a place. So I think that that's a valid reason to use it. She's naming it after an actual place. Also, by the way, as I referenced at the beginning of the episode, like I still sing along to the Stevie Nicks song. It's a complicated one.
I agree. It's for sure a complicated one. A lot of people, by the way, don't even realize that the phrase to gyp someone
means gypsy.
Is also derived from gypsy. So that's actually, a pretty offensive term
that's
to use.
Way more. She doesn't use that in this book. So
no, she doesn't. And people use that 100% to this day, not realizing where it comes from. Right. So, yeah, it's one that's still even now, I think, more borderline than a lot of the depictions stuck in their time that we come across in Christie, which is why it's not major, but
it's not even, to me, the word being used, which I don't have actually that big of a problem with, and probably I would not have taken any points off of. It's Mrs. Lee, the sort of scamming fortune teller. That's where it gets offensive.
Filtered through Mike Rogers.
Yeah, of course.
Again,
she also does give actually Ellie back the money after she does the fortune telling.
And she's killed. I mean, she's one of the murder victims. I actually am in no way judging Christie for anything. No. I think when it comes to this issue, we never are, actually. And sometimes maybe we are, because there are a couple of times when she could have done better. But it's about the reading experience for a reader who's reading it in whatever year we read it, which is, anywhere from 2016 to 2021 and counting.
And the thing is, I would say 0 deductions because it makes sense. But at the same time, I think that we've done it before for lesser things. And I think that we have to take one.
I totally agree. Mike also at some point refers to the arrangement of art in a window as sissy, if you know what I mean. But that also, I think, goes to, you seem a little preoccupied with notions of traditional masculinity there, Mike. Interesting. So I think we're coming out on one deduction. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that brings us to our tallying up for Endless Night. 7 plus 8 plus 7 plus 7 plus 9 minus 1 for a grand total of 37 points, putting, oh my God, Catherine, this is so exciting, putting Endless Night in a tie for 4th place. It not only cracked the top 10, it cracked the top 5. And you know what? I'm thrilled.
It's worth it.
We do have to decide, though, whether it goes above or below Crooked House. What do you think?
It goes above Crooked House.
I totally agree. So here's the thing. It's now nestled between The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Crooked House.
Yep.
That feels perfect to me.
Yep.
Actually perfect.
Yep.
Our new top 10 is as follows. 5 Little Pigs, And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Endless Night, Crooked House, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, The Hollow, Death on the Nile, and in 10th place, The Pale Horse. I'm a little heartbroken that The Murder at the Vicarage was knocked out of the top 10. Not going to lie, it is now sitting at 11th.
Well, you know my feelings about Peril at End House, having been knocked out of the top 10 previously.
Well, now sitting at 12.
Yeah.
Peril at End House, yeah. You know what? We will be discussing the state of the rankings pretty soon. So we'll have an opportunity to do a little bit of recalibrating.
Can I
should we
hint
feel
at
the need.
the one that I think is ranked too high?
Please.
It might be on a train.
Ever since we read Murder on the Orient Express, we've just desperately been trying to push it lower and lower. But the fact remains, it's Murder on the Orient Express. Again, we began this episode with Matthew Pritchard pointing out that it's that novel that is his favorite in a professional capacity because it's been so important to the estate, to the Christie brand overall.
That's their whole thing. Is like, that's why we keep pushing it up. When I don't think either of us wants to, but we keep pushing it up because we feel like we can't lower it. But I'm just saying, we got a state of the rankings coming up next month, my dear.
I'm going to hold firm that it needs to be in the top 10, but you know what? It's in a big old tie with a lot of things too, so it'll be very easy to move that down a few notches, should we want to. This is, even for us, a supersized episode, but we just had a lot to say about this wonderful, wonderful, creepy, late career Christie. And as already mentioned, our next episode is going to be a short story. It is going to be the Miss Marple short story upon which Endless Night is based, the case of the caretaker. We're very excited to be covering that one. And then our next novel will be By the Pricking of My Thumbs. If you would like more from us, I believe we mentioned a few times in this very episode that we do run some bonus content over on our Patreon account. That is at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, Patreon. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Should you want to email us, you could email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And we would be so thankful if you would give us a rating or a review if you haven't yet done so. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.